Professor Arvind Mehta and Emily Carter were never supposed to meet a 67-year-old Indian scholar and a 25-year-old Canadian student whose secret affair began in whispered classrooms and ended in a blood-soaked lecture hall that stunned the entire campus. Professor Arvind Mehta had spent nearly 40 years inside the same university walls, surrounded by books, lecture halls, and curious minds that came and went every few years. He was 67 now, with silver hair that framed a thoughtful face, and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of generations of wisdom. Students respected him not just for his intellect, but for his calm and measured way of speaking. He rarely raised his voice and never seemed rushed, even when deadlines or campus politics tried to test his patience. His office was tucked away at the end of the sociology department corridor, filled with old journals, handwritten notes, and photographs from academic conferences around the world. To anyone passing by, he looked like the picture of contentment, a man fulfilled by his work and reputation. But behind that appearance was a silence that stretched deep into his evenings. His wife, Mira, had died 5 years earlier after a short battle with cancer, leaving behind a home that felt emptier with every passing day. His 2 children, both living abroad, called only on birthdays and holidays, their conversations brief and polite. He often stayed late at the university because it felt less lonely than returning to an empty house. When the fall semester began, he noticed a new student sitting in the second row of his sociology of human behavior class. She had auburn hair, an attentive gaze, and a notebook always open before him started speaking. Her name, as he later learned, was Emily Carter, a 25-year-old Canadian student pursuing her master's degree. She was confident but not arrogant, curious but respectful, the kind of student professors hope to teach. During lectures, she listened intently, sometimes tilting her head when an idea intrigued her, and afterward she would linger as others left, asking him to explain concepts in greater depth. Their conversations began with academic curiosity, questions about cultural psychology and identity studies, but soon extended into longer exchanges about life, ambition, and loneliness. She told him she had moved far from home, leaving behind a complicated family. He shared small fragments of his own story, careful not to reveal too much, though something about her presence made him feel unexpectedly at ease. There was a gentleness in her that reminded him of the comfort he had once shared with his late wife, and for the first time in years, he found himself waiting for someone to walk into his classroom. He noticed little things, how Emily's laughter lingered even after she left, how her essays carried a warmth that most academic writing lacked. The connection felt harmless at first, a mentorship between teacher and student, nothing more. Yet he began to anticipate her visits with an eagerness he hadn't felt in decades. He checked his watch during classes that weren't hers, hoping time would move faster. When she didn't show up one afternoon, he found himself distracted for hours, unable to focus on grading or research. Arvind knew the dangers of forming attachments like this. He had seen colleagues ruined by scandal, reputations destroyed by whispers, but his heart, dulled by years of solitude, began to stir again. He told himself it was simply admiration for a bright mind, a teacher's pride in a promising student. Deep down, however, he knew it was something else, something that both frightened and excited him. Emily Carter had unknowingly walked into a void he had long accepted as permanent, and her presence began to fill it in ways he could no longer control. Their relationship deepened slowly, almost imperceptibly, as the weeks passed. What began as an intellectual connection turned into something far more personal. Emily would often stop by Arvind's office after her classes, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the campus cafe. They would sit together, surrounded by the soft ticking of the old clock on his wall, discussing everything from social theory to films, to the loneliness that seemed to haunt both of them in different ways. She admired his intelligence and patience, his ability to listen without judgment. He admired her curiosity, her energy, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about her dreams. It was a balance neither had experienced before, one built on unspoken needs. As the autumn leaves began to fall across the university courtyard, their meetings became more frequent and more secretive. Arvind started waiting for her messages late at night, his heart skipping at the sound of his phone vibrating on the desk. Emily began visiting his office when the corridors were empty, her laughter echoing softly as he locked the door behind them. To outsiders, it looked like a mentoring relationship, but behind those closed doors, a dangerous intimacy began to grow. For Arvind, the affection felt pure and redemptive. It gave him a reason to wake up each morning, a spark that made the grayness of his life seem suddenly vivid. He began writing more passionately, lecturing with renewed energy, even dressing with more care. But for Emily, the thrill came from the secrecy, the adrenaline of doing something forbidden, of crossing lines she never thought she would cross. She liked the attention, the sense of power that came with being the center of a man's world. Yet deep inside, she knew it couldn't last. She told herself it was just a phase, something she'd move past once the semester ended. But when Arvind began to talk about their future, about retiring early and spending more time together, she grew uneasy. His affection, once endearing, started to feel suffocating. He would text her constantly, asking where she was, who she was with, and why she didn't reply quickly enough. The excitement began to fade, replaced by the quiet pressure of expectation. To create distance, Emily started spending time with other students, joining group study sessions and attending campus events. Among her new circle was Ryan, a fellow graduate student closer to her age, spontaneous and lighthearted. Ryan's easy charm was a stark contrast to Arvind's intensity. The more she laughed with Ryan, the more she realized how complicated her situation with the professor had become. She began avoiding Arvind's calls, replying with brief, polite messages, hoping he would take the hint. But Arvind noticed every change. He saw the way she avoided his eyes in class, how her tone shifted from warmth to formality. The nights he spent waiting for her messages turned into hours of silent anxiety. He replayed every conversation in his head, searching for signs of betrayal. When Emily canceled one of their meetings with the excuse of feeling unwell, he drove past her apartment anyway, parking at a distance and watching her lights go out. The growing paranoia began to consume him. He felt her slipping away and couldn't bear the thought of losing her to someone else. Every rational thought, the professionalism, the ethics, the careful life he had built over decades, started to crumble under the weight of obsession. What had once been a secret affair now felt like an addiction, one he couldn't control or admit to anyone. Arvind told himself it was love, but deep down, he was no longer sure what it was. All he knew was that Emily Carter had become the only thing keeping his heart alive, and the fear of losing her would soon drive him to a place he had never imagined himself capable of going. The first real crack in Arvind's calm exterior appeared the night he saw Emily with Ryan outside the library. It was a cold evening, the kind where the campus felt empty and echoes carried farther than they should. Arvind had stayed late to finish some grading when he noticed the familiar sound of Emily's laughter drifting from across the courtyard. He looked out through his office window and saw her standing under a street lamp, her breath visible in the chilly air as Ryan wrapped his arm around her shoulders. The casual intimacy between them, her smile, the way she leaned into him, hit Arvind like a blade. In that moment, something inside him shifted. He sat frozen in his chair for a long time after they walked away, staring at the darkened window. Every logical thought told him to let it go, to accept that she was young and free to make her own choices. But reason had begun to lose its grip on him. The loneliness he had kept buried for years rose to the surface, twisting into anger and humiliation. By the time he gathered his papers and left his office, his hands were trembling. That night he couldn't sleep. He scrolled through his old messages with her, reading and rereading every word, searching for where things had gone wrong. Over the next few days, Arvind's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He stopped attending faculty lunches and avoided his colleagues. His students noticed that his lectures had become distracted, his usual precision replaced by pauses and unfinished thoughts. He spent hours alone in his office, staring at the empty chair where Emily once sat. When he did see her in class, she was polite but distant, her tone carefully professional. Each interaction felt like a performance, a reminder that their connection was over. One night, unable to bear the silence, Arvind drove to Emily's apartment building. He parked across the street and watched her window from his car. The light stayed on for hours before finally going dark. He sat there, motionless, until dawn began to break. It became a pattern, nights spent in his car, observing her comings and goings, convincing himself he just wanted to talk, to understand. He began tracking her schedule, memorizing her class timings, even following her to the cafe where she often met friends. He saw her laughing with Ryan again, their hands brushing briefly as they shared a drink. Each sighting burned deeper into him, erasing the man he used to be. When Emily received the anonymous message that read, "Secrets always have a price," she laughed it off, unaware of how closely she was being watched. But Arvind's obsession had reached its peak. He broke into her apartment one evening while she was out, using the spare key she had once given him. The air inside smelled faintly of her perfume. On her dresser, he found framed photos, smiling pictures of her and Ryan at a campus event, her arm draped over his shoulder. Arvind stood there, holding the frame in his shaking hands, staring at the proof of what he had feared all along. When he left the apartment, he wasn't the same man who had entered. Something dark had settled in his mind, a certainty that he had been betrayed not just as a lover but as a human being. The next morning, his colleagues noticed that his office door remained locked all day. He didn't answer his phone or respond to emails. Late in the afternoon, a security camera captured him walking across campus, a determined expression on his face, carrying a small leather bag. Inside that bag was a metal trophy from his office, the one he had received years ago for academic excellence. The following day, Emily was scheduled to rehearse her presentation alone in the lecture hall. Arvind knew exactly where she would be and when. The lecture hall was nearly empty that morning, the kind of quiet that only came before sunrise classes or after late night rehearsals. Emily had reserved the space to practice her presentation for an upcoming research symposium. She arrived early, setting her laptop on the podium, rehearsing her opening lines in a calm, steady voice. Outside, the air was heavy with the first hints of winter, the windows fogged from the cold. She didn't notice the faint echo of footsteps in the hallway, the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone approaching the door. Arvind had been waiting for this moment. He had arrived before her, parking his car in a hidden spot behind the science building, his mind clouded by a storm of emotions, rage, sorrow, and a twisted sense of justification. He told himself he only wanted to talk, to make her understand what she had done to him, to confront her betrayal. But deep down, he knew there was something darker waiting beneath that excuse. When he saw her silhouette through the narrow window of the lecture hall door, his heart began to race, pounding in his ears. He pushed open the door quietly, his footsteps echoing through the room. Emily looked up, startled to see him there. Her expression shifted from confusion to unease. She took a small step back as he walked closer, his face pale and drawn. Words passed between them, but none loud enough for anyone outside to hear. She tried to reason with him, to end whatever confrontation he had come to start, but Arvind wasn't listening anymore. In his mind, every sentence she spoke sounded like another betrayal, another rejection of the love he had once believed was pure. The argument grew heated. Emily moved toward the door, trying to leave, but Arvind blocked her way. The desperation in his voice rose to anger, and then, in a moment of blind rage, he reached into his bag and pulled out the heavy metal trophy. What happened next took only seconds, a single strike, a scream that echoed down the empty corridor. Then silence. When campus security responded to the sound, they found the lecture hall door slightly open. The scene inside was one of chaos frozen in time. Emily's body lay near the podium, blood spreading across the carpet in a deep, dark pool. The trophy, streaked with red, rested a few feet away. Her laptop screen still glowed faintly, displaying her unfinished presentation slides. The clock on the wall showed 7:43 a.m., the exact time Arvind was last seen on security footage leaving the building. The police arrived within minutes, cordoning off the area as students gathered outside in disbelief. It was unthinkable that a beloved professor, a man who had shaped so many young minds, could be responsible for something so brutal. Yet the evidence was undeniable. His fingerprints were on the trophy, his car was missing, and his office showed signs of haste. Drawers left open, papers scattered across the floor. Later that evening, investigators discovered his car abandoned near Lake Ontario. The driver's seat was empty, but a notebook lay on the passenger side. Inside were several pages written in Arvind's careful handwriting. It wasn't a confession in the traditional sense, but rather a rambling collection of thoughts about love, betrayal, and guilt. He wrote that he had ended the suffering and that the world would never understand what drove him to do it. The final page simply read, "She was my redemption and I destroyed her." Search teams combed the shoreline for days, expecting to find his body. They found nothing. Some believed he had drowned himself in despair, while others suspected he had planned his disappearance all along. The university shut down classes for a week, the campus wrapped in a heavy silence. The story spread across the city, then across the country, turning a quiet academic scandal into one of the most haunting campus tragedies Canada had ever seen. Months passed, and the memory of the tragedy refused to fade. The university tried to restore its image with memorials, counseling sessions, and promises of tighter faculty oversight. But the story of Professor Arvind Mehta and Emily Carter became a permanent stain on its history. Students whispered about it in corridors. Professors avoided mentioning his name in lectures, and every new batch of freshmen learned the tale as part of campus legend. The lecture hall where Emily had died was sealed for months before being quietly reopened under a new name. Yet those who had been there said the air inside still carried a strange stillness, as if time had refused to move forward. Emily's parents returned to Canada to collect her belongings. Their grief hardened into a quiet fury. They filed a lawsuit against the university, accusing it of negligence for failing to recognize the inappropriate relationship between a senior professor and a young student. The media followed every court update, turning the once respected scholar into a symbol of power abused. Photos of Arvind and Emily together, taken during class projects and university events, circulated online, dissected by strangers who debated whether the signs of their affair had been obvious all along. The police investigation eventually concluded with a grim statement. Professor Arvind Mehta was presumed dead. After weeks of searching, his body was never recovered, but the abandoned car and the tone of his last writings convinced authorities that he had taken his own life. The case was closed, and the world moved on, or at least pretended to. Nearly a year later, in a quiet coastal town in southern India, a new tenant moved into a small rented house near the edge of a fishing village. He called himself Ravi Menon, an unassuming man in his late 60s with neatly combed hair, dark glasses, and a reserved manner. He rarely spoke to neighbors except for polite greetings. He spent most of his time reading newspapers, tending to a small garden, and taking long evening walks along the shore. The locals found him courteous but distant, a man who seemed to prefer silence to company. What no one knew was that inside his modest home, behind the locked drawer of an old wooden desk, he kept a single photograph, a picture of a young woman smiling under the university's clock tower. Her name was Emily Carter. Every night before bed, he would take out the photo, trace the edge of her face with trembling fingers, and sit in silence for hours. Sometimes he would whisper her name softly, as though she might answer. He avoided mirrors and never used his real name when speaking to anyone. His new identity had been carefully built: fake documents, new glasses, even a slight change in the way he spoke. The man once known as Professor Arvind Mehta had erased himself, leaving behind nothing but questions and a ghost story whispered across 2 continents. One evening, during the monsoon season, a local news channel played a documentary revisiting the Toronto campus murder. The television flickered in Ravi's dark living room as the reporter narrated the details, The forbidden love, the obsession, the blood, stained lecture hall, the missing professor. When Emily's photo appeared on the screen, his hands began to shake. The sound of rain against the tin roof grew louder, drowning out the reporter's voice. He reached forward and switched off the television, but the image of her face remained in his mind, as clear as it had been that day in the lecture hall. Outside, thunder rolled over the sea. Inside, Ravi sat motionless, the photo still clutched in his hand. For a long time he stared at the closed door, as though expecting someone to knock. Then, in a barely audible voice, he whispered, "I'm sorry." It was unclear whether he meant it for her, for himself, or for the life he had destroyed. And as the storm raged through the night, the man who had once been Arvind Mehta disappeared again into silence, leaving behind only the faint echo of a tragedy that never truly ended.